Sam, otherwise known as SD Wickett, is a writer for Bournebrook magazine, and has kindly joined me on the channel today for an interesting conversation, I'm sure. Thank you very much for joining me, Sam. We might as well carry on where we left off before we started recording. Um, you're a writer.
Mhm.
How long have you been? How long have you been writing?
Well, forever, really. I mean, the first kind of inkling that there was something there was I, the school I went to was very keen on kind of producing artists, the prep school I went to. And they would hold an annual competition that sort of coincided with the school's book fair. And I wrote a story when I was 7 or 8 about okay, bear in mind, this is from the mind of a child, but I wrote a story about a ghost who's afraid of the dark, and I named him Plop. And it won the first prize, and I actually ended up getting a grant of £250, which I didn't receive until I was 18, which got me good and drunk on my 18th birthday. And from there, I kind of just I was always writing something. I was in lessons. I wouldn't be doing my notes. I'd be sort of making things up and that sort of thing. I think the first thing that came was I would write kind of, I suppose, what you now call self-insert fan fiction of, like, The Simpsons and Family Guy and that sort of thing when I was like a
Mm.
child. And then I started, I think, like many kids, I had many phases when I was like, 9 through like 13, 14. I had like a phase I was really into like animals, really into like Star Wars, Marvel, all those kind of, obligatory child phases. And I would always write something around that. I write like a sort of Andy McNabb style, SAS type book or a superhero book, which was always things like that. And then one day, my eldest sister found something that I'd written, and the mockery was so great that I didn't show anyone what I'd written for about 10 years afterwards. And then from there, it was kind of, I kind of grew up a bit, got interested in girls, sort of, the obligatory teenage mistakes. And then I started writing seriously again at university. That's
Okay.
what came from
I
it.
mean, £250 though, back in, how old were you again?
I was 7 or 8, so that would have been around 2003, 2004.
Yeah, for a famously unremunerative profession, that's a great start though. That's
Oh,
a great
honestly.
encouragement.
And bear in mind, I'm just about too old to have got the Tony Blair Trust Fund. So I didn't I didn't get that money, sort of squirreled away until I was 18. So that came in very handy. I mean, obviously I wasted it almost immediately, but it was the first sign that I actually could do something with it.
Mm.
I was probably too young to notice then, but thinking back on it, it was very much like the sort of the birth of an artist kind of moment.
Yeah, reading a lot of your stuff online, I do get that. I mean, I don't mean this as an insult in any way at all. I consider it a compliment actually, because I think the modern world is distinctly lacking in it. Because we're so cynical. But there's a romanticism to your view of the creative life, and in the books that you reference and the artists you reference. I mean, Brideshead's your favorite war novel, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, yeah.
And I find that refreshing that you do see the writing life in that way. May I ask, did you ever finish any of those early drafts?
No. Well, the ones I did finish, it was like a 7-page book with a massive, Deus Ex Machina to sort of conveniently wrap the plot. None of them ever really got finished in terms of, them being, even for a child standard, ready to kind of be seen by anyone. No, I mean, the first serious book I ever tried to write, I was in my late teens, and I wrote a kind of dystopian novel, which weirdly, if you look back on it, it's kind of, it feels like it could have been inspired by kind of the COVID era, kind of, sort of the mandatory vaccination push, that sort of thing. But I read
Mm.
it back not too long ago, and it was just this unbearably whiny, like cynical, but in a really annoying way, kind of like Colin Caulfield type writing.
Yep.
But no, so the novel that I've written that's coming out through the Bournemouth Press, either later this year or early next year. That's the first piece I've ever actually finished, um, which is I think it'll give me some sort of lifelong bond with that work, whatever becomes of it because of that. because it's the first thing I ever truly saw out.
Yeah. It's a slog, isn't it? I myself have only ever finished one piece of long fiction, and by long, it was 100 pages exactly. So really, just a novella. A friend of mine wrote um, well, the Little Platoon. In fact, you may have heard of him. Um, he wrote a 600-page novel on a typewriter he got for his birthday over the course of about a year, and I'm a bit more of a short distance runner in that regard. I think I'd love to write a novel one day, but one of the things that attracts me about poetry is that you can, you know, in these short bursts of
Yeah.
creative inspiration, you can create these short lyric pieces. So yeah, how long is your novel, if I can ask?
Well, it's quite long. It's about 450 pages,
Okay, so yeah,
about
pretty
100,
respectable.
about 120, 130,000 words.
Yeah,
But I mean, when I was writing it though, it was effectively the only thing in my life for that period of time.
it consumes you, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It was the summer of last year, and I had left my job, um, and for reasons that I won't go into, I wasn't concerned with money, and all I had to do was wake up and spend the day kind of grappling with this kind of intellectual marathon that I was running, or more creative marathon that I was running. And something quite weird happened where somewhere along the road, it felt as if the people that I was writing were my friends. And I missed them greatly if I wasn't able to kind of be with them. It was this weird kind of like parasocial thing with my own work. Um, where yeah, I just became utterly obsessed with it. But no, to answer your question, I'm very bad at answering questions directly. It's fairly long. It's about 400 pages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. And so one of the questions I was burning to ask you because well it concerns style. Okay. So Brideshead, which again is your favorite of War's novels, and I think ultimately mine, to be honest. I think A Handful of Dust is his most sort of perfect as a work of art, from a craftsmanship perspective. But Brideshead, it reminds me of my university experience, which
Yeah.
was quite unique in so many wonderful ways. So I think just for pure sort of nostalgia value, it's got to be Brideshead. But War himself said of Brideshead, in retrospect, I think when he was writing the introduction, a new introduction for it after the war, that he found the prose um, rather ornate looking back at it, and that it was partly that way because he wrote it at a time of rations and shortage, and he was sort of longing for that plump baroque world. And afterwards, he found this distasteful, I think was the word he used, and he went back to his much more spare, economical, almost telegraphy style. And I wanted to ask you whether you had any general opinions on style, because I'm rather obsessed with it, probably in an unhealthy and unproductive way. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, because I feel like the prevailing style, David Bentley Hart, a theologian I quite like, called it the house style of postmodernity or late capitalism or something like that, and it's very pared down and get your point across as quickly as possible. There aren't many writers anymore. I mean, Cormac McCarthy was one of them, but he died recently. There aren't many writers who are really toying with language in a legitimately literary way. Um, Herman Melville, for instance, he's Moby Dick is probably my favorite novel. So, I mean, do you have any thoughts on the question of style and where we're at with it at the moment?
It's a tough question to answer because the first thing to know about myself as a writer is that I'm an absolute layman when it comes to writing. I have no sort of theoretical knowledge of writing as a sort of as a science almost. But in a way, I prefer that because it means that I'm not holding myself back from what I think to be a good bit of prose because I'm thinking technically. I think the question of why postmodernity is so kind of curt with its writing is probably something to do with how postmodernity views kind of higher standards as being, in a way, elitist, and being elitist as being bad. Um, and there's this kind of very virulent anti-nostalgia in that kind of way of viewing writing.
Yes.
Um, so when it comes to my own approach, I like to write beautifully. I like to, write a sentence I finish writing or I read back and I just go, wow, like, that sort of thing. I like to kind of put together words in a beat and a rhythm and in a combination that makes something kind of click in that part of you that triggers when you see a nice vista or a nice building. But at the same time, I want it to be accessible. So, I don't know if you and I have discussed this, but I got a bit of sort of heat recently because I was talking smack about Ulysses and how it's the way it's written is this kind of impenetrable wall almost, where it's very hard to get past the first few pages without just going, fuck this. So can I swear?
Yeah, no, we're it's a 30-second rule. That's fine.
Okay, gotcha.
Once you're 30 seconds in, it's
Right, no worries. Um, so I like to be accessible in the language so anyone can understand it, but also it kind of rather than it being kind of above your head, it kind of reaches down and kind of pulls you up with it.
Mm.
So I don't like to write a sentence that only an academic can sort of hazard a guess at. I like anyone to read it, but anyone who reads it can you know feel themselves being kind of elevated by it, which is a hard thing to do. You're treading the line effectively between the high and the low,
Mm.
um, while not being in the middle. It's a tough puzzle to figure out, which is why I write on instinct rather than with any kind of theoretical backing.
It's probably for the best, to be honest with you. What you say about Ulysses reminds me of Martin Amis's thing about that. He said Joyce was a writer who sort of he invites his guest, the reader, into his house, and he shows him to a bare, uncomfortable chair in a bare, cold kitchen, and serves him gruel, and whereas someone like Nabokov, I still don't know how to pronounce that properly. Nabokov invites you in and he sits you down in a plush leather armchair and gives you some cognac and everything. I've never read Ulysses, so I can't really comment, but I know that's the case with Nabokov. You pick up anything he wrote, and for me, the pleasure of even just sub-vocalizing the words, let alone reading them out loud, it's almost physical pleasure.
Well, do you study writing at all, or do you, like myself, do you kind of just you have a vague sense of what's good and bad writing, and you just kind of write and refine over time without sort of concerning yourself with theory?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you mean by theory. My grasp of English grammar is actually quite poor on paper. It's the grasp that a reasonably fluent native speaker would have. But I mean, my ex was Italian, and their grasp of English grammar was infinitely better than mine because they've had to go through the rudiments, in school. But I suppose I've had to interest myself in some theoretical elements of it because as a copywriter, former copywriter, uh, you kind of have to take yourself back to school in a way. You can't. It's not like creative writing in that sense. You can't just unleash what you want to unleash. You have to go through the motions, introduction, premise, conclude, all of that stuff. But as I've gotten older, I say older, I mean, I'm 28, but the more I've written, the more I think actually being overly conscious of style when you're writing is probably really counterproductive because you lose your voice. I think the best thing to do is just to write your heart out and go back and see what doesn't work and clean it up.
Yeah, and one thing that kind of comes to mind is have you ever seen the film Dead Poet Society?
I have, yes.
Where he in his first lesson they got that book and it's sort of a scientific like way of rating a poem.
Yes, I remember. Yeah.
Tear the pages out and then just write on instinct. There's sort of I know there's something kind of postmodern about that, but it just instinctively kind of hits right with me. That yeah, just write because obviously I think very 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 few writers' first work is their best objectively. So as you age, as you get older, you kind of you figure out just by trial and error what works with your voice. But yeah, so to base it all on someone else's understanding of what writing is or should be, Yeah, for me, it seems counterproductive. So too does working in a non-creative form of writing. My first job after university involved writing, sort of technical writing, and I found that it completely stunted my ability to write creatively. I don't know if you felt the same when you were copywriting.
Do you know what? I think it must have, because I don't recall writing anything of creative worth at all during that period. And that was nearly a full year, partly because you're so tired at the end of a
Yeah.
working day. And also, well, I mean, it depends what you're doing during the working day, but if you spend 8 hours writing to deadline, the last thing you want to write creatively afterwards, but you just think, oh, I've been doing that all day. I just want to watch a movie or
Yeah,
something.
exactly. Yeah, it's like, and to give a sort of a different example of that, a very good friend of mine is a chef, and he used to work in sort of Michelin star restaurants. And when he would come home from work, he would eat a pot noodle or like beans on toast because the last thing he wanted to do, even though he this was his vocation, is what he dedicated his working life to. He had to have that barrier between work and non-work, and you know, like most writers are our age, I do need to work to pay rent and pay the bills. So I have like an internal line where I refer to one as my job and one as my work. But like when you I think if you write, especially things that you are compelled to write rather than what you want to write, I don't think any copywriter who's also creative has woken up and this kind of thunderbolt of inspiration hits and they go and write corporate copy for Maybelline. You know,
I wish I'd been writing for Maybelline. My clients were rather more boring. Many of them were in HR, which is, I mean, my God, pair PR with HR, and you've got you're in Dante's Sixth Circle by then.
Yeah, and I mean, PR is one thing. I mean, obviously, that there are other people who work in PR and yourself, and they're fine. HR is like, I think that is genuinely something that sucks the humanity out of people.
Mm,
The HR person at my office is not a real person, almost. You
yeah.
know, just not a real person. I remember one time I was kind of pulled in for for a stern talking to, and I was asked, what's your greatest strength? And I gave some, banal theories about, my creative instincts and whatever. And then she replied, no, 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 no. Your greatest strength is your smile. And I had to fight the urge to just quit on the spot and go home. I just did not want to be there after that. And that's almost, I'm not sure if you read it, but I read a piece for Bournebrook a while ago called "The Curse of the Complex Mind," and it's how
I
people
did.
people who do have that kind of otherworldly calling to create, be they artists or painters or filmmakers or musicians, will invariably in their lives come up against the sort of normal worlds, and it's quite jarring for them because
Mm,
the values and what's important are just so completely different between the two.
yeah. It's also the curse of the commonsensical mind, I feel. I mean, I don't want to overdo common sense as a virtue. Um,
It's a bit GB News, isn't it?
it's a bit GB News, yeah, but well, okay, let's call, like a bullshit detector.
Well, yeah,
And I mean, so I did have some good experiences as a copywriter for PR. Don't get me wrong. I learned a lot writing about the energy industry, for instance. Learning things I never thought I would learn. But yeah, no, with the HR clients, it's more just, what do you actually mean by what you've just said? It's so devoid of actual concrete meaning. And as a writer, you're trying to wrest meaning out of the chaos of ambiguity and experience.
yeah, yeah.
Um, that's what your job literally is. You're putting meaning um, lucidly, with any luck, onto the page for other people to absorb. And I think HR is just the literal enemy of that practice. Um, but there we are.
Yeah, it is. It is. I think you and I have another sort of affliction too, which is kind of. I don't know if you'd refer to yourself as being, like an old soul or anything like that, but I mean,
Oh, I most certainly am. In fact, just briefly there, when I was born, my immediate nickname was Lilla Gubben, which I'm told is Swedish for little old man, because I was literally grey and had crowlines. So I'm very much an old soul.
I was also referred to as a little old man. One story my mum loves to retell for some reason because she's totally at fault here. She once left me by accident in a supermarket. And received and sort of realized and urgently race back, and there was no worry. I was just sat on the floor reading the backs of like Nutrigrain boxes, sort of reading the ingredients, trying to figure out what they were. I was completely unfazed by it. I didn't even know where she was gone. But the affliction that I would refer to it as being sort of like the plight of old souls in the modern world, and especially in like a geographical sense, because I won't obviously disclose, but you and I are from the same county.
Mm.
You probably from a more pastoral part than I am. Where I live is effectively sort of the kind of middle class denosphere. And when I leave the house wearing what I wear, the looks that I get are very kind of unnerving for someone who is quite introverted like myself.
Do you
And
don ties and things like this?
I wear a tie to work, but with that exception, there's very little between my work attire and my regular attire. Yeah, I'm always wearing a blazer. I'm always wearing like a button-down shirt. I never wear jeans or t-shirts or anything like, or trainers or anything like that. But I walk around like someone from a bygone age, dressed down. And it's not through any sort of pretension. I don't do it, to sort of to peacock or anything like that. I do it because it's just standard, self-expression, and I'd feel like I was being a bit of an imposter if I didn't dress the way I do, because it's how I feel inclined to dress. But the way I talk, it's like in your video, the death of oratory, you spoke about being at a state comprehensive school, and being well spoken was sort of a target on your back.
Yeah, it really was. I believe in that video I recount the experience. There was this girl in my psychology class, and she had the temerity to pronounce the L in milk. So because we would say it what others would say it milk.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
And honestly, the vitriol that she was subjected to, it was a real eye opener to me. Because I mentioned to you before, my grandmother gave me sort of unofficial elocution lessons on her lap. And when I went to state school, I had to sort of dumb that down. And it's not like I don't, we all put on airs to a certain extent online. I don't really care how anyone speaks. Well, I do, but it's less about what accent you have or what pronunciation you have, and more that you take pride in your expression
Yeah.
of your use of the English language, and you can do that in any dialect or anything. But an increasing number of people, I feel, don't bother. I mean, it is just subliterate.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is that there's this now. I mean, I can't speak directly for the past, but I can imagine there was either one or two things: either a class comfort, you were just whatever you were born as, you were kind of, you accepted that, right? Like, for example, in that famous picture of Toffs and Tufts, of those two street kids and those two Harrow kids, one of the kids was asked, did you resent the Harrow kids? He said, no, not at all, nothing at all. Or there was, if noblesse oblige is to be believed, there was this kind of with this kind of reverence for the upper classes. It was they were sort of seen as being celebrities in their own right in the area. Whereas what I see now is this kind of absolute inversion of that, where people who are of the middle or upper middle class really, really want to be like roadmen.
Yeah.
There are people who I know for a fact went to the same, fee-paying public school that I went to, who sound like they'd come from a council estate, in the bad part of town. It's the strangest thing. I've never seen anything like it before in this set. I mean, when I was a kid, everyone kind of liked the kind of chav aesthetic, the kind of the Burberry aesthetic. But now people really do pretend to be of a lower station than they actually are. It's
Yeah, there's an insincerity to that. I mean, where I live is a fairly affluent area, all things considered. I mean, much of the southeast is compared to the rest of the country. But one of my best friend growing up, I no longer speak with him. We just grew apart. But he was from a very much lower sort of socioeconomic background than I was, and he lived in a poorer area, and there was an authenticity to what they wore there and how they spoke there, because just it's who they were. Whereas now, I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with Theodore Dalrymple. Yeah, he speaks often in his writing about his because he used to be a doctor in Africa as well as sort of I think it was Birmingham where when he was a prison doctor. But he said in his travels in Africa, you know, the poorest people imaginable, way poorer than literally anyone in Britain, unless you're totally destitute and homeless, they would scrimp and save to buy, you know, secondhand Western clothes essentially, but they'd all be in
Yeah,
suits and ties and dresses and things.
yeah.
He returns to affluent Britain by comparison, and you've got people who can afford nice clothes, but they're wearing like ripped jeans. And he's just said, you know, I wouldn't have met anyone in poorest Africa who would have worn ripped. They would have considered it shameful. So it's this. I think it's born of inverse snobbery, though. A lot of
Yeah, 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 yeah,
are
yeah.
actually they've clocked that the paradigm has shifted from its 1920 whatever, pick your year, and that they don't want to be seen that way.
Have you seen the film Metropolitan by Whit Stillman? It's
Was
if
that
you
one of
haven't.
the early sci-fi movies, or
No,
maybe?
no, no, that's Metropolis. No,
Ah,
this is a film from 1990. It's an independent film from 1990. I recommend anyone who's of our kind of ilk to go and watch it. It's a love letter to the kind of American preppy class
right.
in its kind of dwindling days. And there's a very interesting exchange between. So the film is about a kind of middle class, kind of Marxist revolutionary. Oh no, sorry, he's a Fourierist, not a Marxist, who just by chance ends up part of this kind of like socialite circle of New York City, kind of preppy to Ivy League types. And he just kind of gradually sheds his socialism over the course of the film. There's an interesting exchange towards the beginning when he's first being welcomed in. And he expresses to one of the kind of socialites that he doesn't want anything to do with their world. And the guy says, what principle is that? The one that, one shouldn't go out and eat hors d'oeuvres when they could be at home thinking of the less fortunate. Well, maybe you're the less fortunate. And he sort of rips them apart for having this kind of arrogance, this kind of middle class arrogance, but deeming you're less fortunate, you're fortunate. And the film is I think like myself, it kind of venerates class. It's not as being necessarily a economic thing, but a cultural thing.
Hmm.
And kind of accepting your station and kind of making your life out of that, because it does give you kind of comfortable parameters to live your life in, whereas what we have today is kind of a lot of people you meet have kind of dashed dreams in a way, you know. I don't remember what the question even was. I waffled
No,
completely.
it's fine. I mean, this is how conversation works, I suppose. I do want to move on to politics, and I suppose we're edging into it already. We can return to writing and all the rest of it at any point, but on this class point, it is really interesting, isn't it? Because the education I got was that in the past, class was this massively enormous thing, and even though this was never said to me, the impression that you got was, well, it's no longer a thing.
Sure.
But I do think it's still the main
Absolutely.
heuristic, if that's the right word,
Absolutely.
for
Absolutely.
analyzing British society. It kind of reminds me of that piece you wrote for Bournebrook. I can't remember the title.
The myth of class mobility.
No, no, it
Oh,
was
no.
your time among the upper
Oh,
classes.
my week among the aristocrats. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
your week among the aristocrats, which I really enjoyed because one of the questions I was left with. So for the record, I do, I'm middle class. You can't get more middle class. Um, I do think that snobbery is most prevalent in the middle classes as opposed to the upper classes. If to the extent that we still have them, I mean, it's all very nouveau riche nowadays, isn't it? We don't have very much inherited aristocracy anymore. Um, but one of the questions I was left with was, notwithstanding the snobbery of the middle classes, which you can see in pretty much every page of The Guardian nowadays, when you were spending that weekend there, did you ever, or have you ever, in a similar context, felt resentment? Because I I have sometimes been among people who are of higher classes than I am, or higher stock, if you will, and they have said things that have made me angry, or rather skeptical that they really understand
Yeah,
other people.
yeah. So if I can kind of just expand a little bit, I'm the same as you. I'm middle class. I was just fortunate enough to have had grandparents who had the means to sort of fund my education at a school far above my economic station. When it comes to my week among them, I mean, there were a few things. There are things like like people love to ask, what school did you go to? Because they're expecting to know quite intimately the school that you mentioned, being one of the sort of Arthurian League schools. And there is this kind of there's definitely envy, because I mean
Hmm.
I was fully aware even then, even though I was at university at the time, that after those sort of halcyon years were over, I would have to go and find a job that kind of crushed me and devour me from the inside, and they wouldn't. There was definitely jealousy there, but resentment is something else. Resentment is jealousy with a desire to sort of make us that the source of the jealousy isn't there anymore, right? It's like a destructive jealousy. Whereas I see many of the ills of my society as being as a result of that class being usurped by the money class, by the by sort of the upstarts and the nouveau riche. And the article that I thought you were referring to, the myth of class mobility, sort of does tie in here because in that I posit that the UK is one of the very few societies where class and money are not linked. You could be a millionaire, like a millionaire of the working class, and a penniless aristocrat. It's because it's a factor of how you're raised, right? I mean, if you're middle class, you'll go to either a comp in an affluent area, so a good comp, a grammar school if they still exist where you are, or a sort of an independent day school, right? Not a public school. So the way you kind of incubate as a person is set in those years, and that's very much, and the environment that you incubate in is very much tethered to your class. And also, people just don't lose it. I mean, again, the UK is a very rare society in that you can tell by the way someone speaks, notwithstanding the previous discussion we had about people feigning a lower class. You can tell where someone's from and what class they're from immediately within minutes of knowing them. So it's such a fixed part of British society. And to answer the question, no, there's no resentment. I do not wish to destroy that world because it was one of the best weeks of my life.
Yeah, no, I mean, reading it, I was jealous. I thought, God, I'd love to have been there and seen that because I love visiting country houses. And obviously most of them aren't inhabited anymore. Um, but
Yeah,
yeah, just it sounded very Bridesheadian, as you say in the piece.
it's palatial. Yeah, and I think there's one quite good line in that, if I was to myself, where I talk about how I completely failed to adapt to country life. In terms of I was no good at any of the sports, and I made a quip in the article about how when I walk into the field, rifle in hand, the clay pigeons thank their lucky stars because they all survived the night. Like, 'cause I was hitting none of them. The
And
re
that's actually a line that jumped out at me as being one of the most memorable. So yeah,
yeah the recoil nearly took my bloody arm off, and that sort
yeah,
of thing. But no, it was a great week. And with people that I miss very much, and who unfortunately, as you mentioned with your old friend, time just kind of carried us in different directions, and
yeah,
it's just
yeah.
how it is.
I wouldn't want to see the disappearance of that world either. And this debate it's relevant now because lots of people, as with the word democracy, uh, the word equality is thrown around. And as soon as anyone says, I don't think I've ever said this in print, but if someone were to say, as some have said, actually a degree of economic equality, inequality is not just inevitable, which of course is the case, but desirable, you're
Yep.
looked at with horror, but you never get a chance to explain, which is that if you didn't have economic inequality of some kind, or class inequality, let's call it. First of all, that would be an indicator that you're living in some sort of communist
Yeah.
hellhole in which everyone is equally poor except the Politburo. But second of all, why would you want to live in a world or a country without that kind of diversity? And I hate to use the word diversity because it's been co-opted, but I think conservatives are, they should take it back because
Yeah. Well,
it's like Shakespeare's quote, untune that string and hark what discord follows. Now, I'm not saying, okay, you're poor, you stay poor, pleb. I'm not saying that. I mean, indeed, one of the great things about British society and this is no longer really the case, I think, but partly because we destroyed the grammar schools, is that you did have that ladder. You did have that class mobility,
yeah.
which no longer exists.
I recall. So you and I are not Blair babies. We're John Major babies, right? And John Major's an engineer.
I
You're 28, and you'd have been born in 44, 94 and 95, right?
95, yeah. Am I a John Major baby?
Yeah. So you and I both are.
I thought of it that way.
So he's very kind of forgotten about member of the sort of the pantheon of British heads of government. But if you look at him, I mean, he is a bit of a trend breaker. He didn't go to public school nor university. He did, I believe, go to a grammar school. And as well as that, I mean, there's a very interesting exchange. I don't know if you saw it between David Starkey and Laurie Penny.
Is that the one where he points at
He
her?
points in her face and said,
Yeah,
this
that's
grammar
just a
school boy,
seminal moment, isn't it?
this grammar school boy will not listen to a public school girl talk
Yeah,
like
very
that.
interesting exchange.
And it's obviously as you mentioned in the Hitchens video, it is kind of it's kind of a bygone political issue. They're kind of all gone, apart from weirdly my town, which is four. But yeah, they offered a public school tier education for free, and to look down on that because it asks a lot of the students is this kind of it's a very bizarre trend where children are seen as being utterly stupid. Like I read Kipling's Jungle Book quite recently, and I realized it's a children's book, right? That affirms courage and friendship and fraternity, and it's written in a way that is quite sophisticated. If you compare it to a book written for the same age grade of our time, that would be Captain Underpants. But again, I keep waffling off in different directions. But
no, I mean that's exactly the kind of illusion I love, and yeah, I mean you're quite right. Yeah, no, children's literature has certainly taken a turn for the worst. I love Jungle Book, and I actually love the original animation as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I'm trying to think what Captain Underpants might be a little unfair as a comparison. I'm trying to think what the equivalent would be now. Something written by, oh God, what's his name? I think he did We're Going on a Bear Hunt or something like that.
Right, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Like that, yeah.
Yeah.
Even still, I mean, it's
Rosen, Michael Rosen.
Yeah. The question of grammar schools is interesting. It's well, do you want class mobility or not? Or do you want such a mobility or not? And that was, provably a very good source of it. It's what got kids from, sort of working or lower middle class backgrounds into Oxbridge. Whereas now I don't even know if Oxbridge could be considered, top 5 schools globally now, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, if I had children now, which I don't, but I'd love children one day. I wouldn't actually encourage them to go to university at all, which is not something I would have said, if you'd asked me 10 years ago.
It's odd though, isn't it? Because while I do now think back on my time at university in an academic sense as being, debatably a waste of 4 years of my life, I do think about my time there as being something that was very positive on me. I very much loved where I was studying. It was a very kind of historic city in the north of England. I had a very wonderful 4 years there. But no, you're right. I mean, in terms of making you a functional kind of adjusted adult, bear in mind the trend it's on. I think by the time we do have kids, they're 18, which will be like 20, 25 years. I can't imagine how bad it'll be. Worse, probably.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you ask Peter Hitchens, he'll tell you to get out while you still can. I'm not sure if you saw my
Yeah.
my argument with him about that recently. Um, but no, let Sam. I'd like to ask more about your politics explicitly. So, you're writing from what seems to me a conservative perspective, and I mean conservative in the broadest possible sense, as am I suppose. Increasingly, I myself have I had a conversation much like this one with a chap called Morgoth's Review a few months ago, and that sort of, to some people, situated me on this amorphous thing called the dissident right, which I still have no idea what that actually is. But increasingly, I'm impatient with labels and certainly the left-right spectrum. And I only use the word conservative of myself to make it easier to have conversations with people.
Yeah, sure.
But I myself have no developed political philosophy. I just have a series of intuitions and instincts and, opinions. What's your political philosophy or label, if you have one? And how did you get to where you are? Why are you not a progressive, for instance?
It's a good question. I may need to sort of just start talking and kind of think about the answer while I'm talking. I I think just to begin with on the dissident question, I think semantics matter in politics, and if you position yourself as being a dissident, then that's all you'll ever be, and you'll never win anything. If you have this kind of chip on your shoulder, victim mentality going into politics, I think that will kind of stay with you.
Hmm.
The question of my sort of political journey is more my journey into, through, and then out of politics. And I would say, in a way, I mean, obviously, this is going to counteract what I've just said, but I would use the word reactionary, not in the sense of Curtis Yarvin or anything like that, but because all of the milestones in my kind of like political journey have been in reaction to something. Um, I think just growing up, I don't know what it is. I always, my bullshit alarm always just went off around kind of liberal assumptions, and I think it's because, and this is quite embarrassing to say, but I think my first kind of experience of political consciousness would have been, sort of anonymous, you know, like
Oh, I got the with the
yeah,
masks.
yeah. When I was like 14, 15, I think I was thoroughly red pilled by like Illuminati exposed videos on YouTube back in the day. I think that was the first thing I ever really seriously engaged with politically, and that kind of made me a skeptic to begin with. That was the first thing that ever really kind of resonated with me politically. Also, as well as that, I remember watching the 2010 election and wanting David Cameron to win. I don't know why, I just naturally did. And so from there, it's a matter of reacting to a series of events, and in between, kind of checking out of it. Obviously, the next big thing was the sort of the combo punch of Jeremy Corbyn and then Brexit, both of which, again, my reaction to aligned me with certain people. I think one thing that people who are on the quote unquote right find is that I think that's why we end up sort of very quickly leaving these groups we kind of form, is because what we find is that suddenly, based on our reaction to an event, we're in a lifeboat with a bunch of people, and you don't choose who's in the lifeboat with you. You reacted negatively to a certain event, and then suddenly you're aligned with people that you wouldn't normally associate with, right? So Brexit happened, and then I was very much on that train. And then somewhere along the line, I became a kind of libertarian, which is possibly what I look back on with the most embarrassment, because it was thoroughly Americanized. My view of the world by that point, it was like, hands off my guns, don't tread on me. And then I had something like, what the hell are you talking about? You don't live in America. Hands off my guns. That was muted, in 30 years ago. And then I think the real big thing that happened after that point was, COVID, and then the summer of 2020. Looking on your phone each morning, kind of doom scrolling and seeing like apocalyptic scenes in major Western urban areas, really fills you with this kind of bitter anger that you should probably get out of your life as soon as you can. And then from that point afterwards, I just kind of lost faith in the whole thing, and that's when I kind of checked out of politics and realized that, I get infinitely more pleasure from writing poetry and novels than I do from just complaining about things. But in a word, reactionary, because all I've ever done really in politics is react to events that are out of my control.
Yeah, and I feel like obviously this sets up an objective standard by which to judge these things, but I feel like anyone with an ounce of common sense and again your bullshit detector is sort of doomed to be a reactionary anyway, because so much of modern life, it's like going back to what you were saying about being a creative in a world that sort of hates you. You're always reacting. You always find yourself complaining, and it takes a lot to not complain, because then you just become boring to people. I mean, one of my favorite lines of poetry by my favorite poet of all time, W.H. Auden, is life remains a blessing, although you cannot bless. And that's sort of, there's the real danger of becoming, a misanthrope, if you give in to that
Which I,
reaction.
which I I kind of am, and I really don't like the fact that I'm a misanthrope. I feel like I'm one against my will, where in theory I love humanity in principle, but I dislike most people that I meet. You
I've
know?
always said to myself, it's a good thing God loves everyone, because I find it really difficult.
Yeah. No, right. Yeah. No, it's true. It's true, and I don't want that to be the case.
Yeah.
But I'm not gonna like. I suppose I approach kind of radical honesty there, where I don't try and hide these things. Unfortunately, I look around at most people. I'm like, what are you wearing? Why are you slacking your jaw like that? Why are you eating Mackey's chips in the middle of the high street? Like, what? I don't understand most people, it's not like
Um,
I'm not like on the spectrum or anything. I just have the sort of the plight of the old soul, where I find the contemporary world just so baffling and alienating, and one symptom of that, unfortunately, is being a misanthrope.
it's dementing.
Yeah,
It's a dementing world in which to live, particularly as a young person. I feel. I mean, I don't want to sort of get the world's smallest violin out, but I don't think there's any denying that people of our age and our generations, um, on the one hand, we have it easy in the sense that we've got all of the world's knowledge on a handy little device.
also it's very easy to be alive.
It's very easy to be alive, yeah, in the biological sense. I assume you mean.
Yeah.
Um, and I can get a £4 bottle of wine from Lidl. I'm happy. But on the other hand, my father, and this is no fault of his, my father bought his first house when he was what, 24, something like that, on
Yeah.
less than the salary I had in my previous job. He got on the property ladder, he was able to have kids, and all the rest of it, because you need an economic incentive to have kids ultimately. It's very difficult for people of our generation, and I think that's part of the reason so few of us are actually attracted to conservative thought,
Mhm.
because why would you be when the impulse is to tear down things that aren't working?
Yeah.
um, but this feeds into my next question to you, and feel free to feedback on anything I just said. Your journey out of politics, I'd like to know more about that. Was it, because I still engage in politics, don't get me wrong, I never at a party level, God forbid, but I've certainly tried to distance myself from it, uh, because I find I never thought I'd say this, because I kind of admire him in some respects, but people like Douglas Murray, for instance, um, they they really quite bore me now. Douglas Murray wrote his first book is a biography of Lord Alfred Douglas.
It is, yeah. Bosie. Yeah.
It's really good. It's a really good work of biography. I wish he'd do more stuff like that, because ever since he became sort of a talking head on, GB News or the Piers Morgan show or whatever, it's just this endless sort of, it's like the Joker and Batman, the two sides need each other. And ultimately, when you click on one of these videos, whether it's by trigonometry or of Douglas Murray or Piers Morgan, whoever it is, you're going to hear the same talking points, the same complaints, the same things. And it's not that they aren't saying things that need to be heard, but it just gets boring after a while. So that was my sort of disillusionment with all of this. Why did you decide to sort of get out of it, as it were?
Well, the first thing is on the question of people like the various talking heads, I would compare it to a window salesman walking around in the dead of night with a bag full of bricks, right? You need to justify your own paycheck constantly, right? So if you've made your brand and you've made your living around complaining around what the wokies are up to, then they're always up to something. They're always they're always up to something. Granted, eventually they are invariably, but that's a big thing. The big thing is I found that I was just complaining and it was making me unhappy and I was just miserable. And Bournebrook, the magazine that I work with and write for and used to do podcasts for. Um, I mean, at the time, going back to the reactionary thing, we were very much on the kind of the sort of the lockdown skeptic, against the vaccine mandate sort of thing. But then I found that like each week when we were preparing to do the weekly podcast, we were just thinking, all right, what's happening in COVID news? What's happening in in this and that? We were just looking for reasons to be angry. And the older I get, I'm nearer to 30 than I'm 20 now. I just don't want to be angry anymore. And if getting politics out of my life is what does that, then that's one part of it. The other is that I just it's hard to engage meaningfully in democracy when you don't believe in democracy being a particularly good thing. You know, and going back to what you said earlier about why is it that when you say when you sort of discount the benefits of equality and diversity, you get kind of attacked because that's effectively the state religion and you're committing blasphemy. And so it's because it's the question of does a Catholic hang around in the caliphate? It's a world that I have nothing to offer because I disagree with its very presence.
So when you mentioned democracy, as it happens, I've just written a piece for Substack. I'm hesitating whether to publish or not. It's a review of Nick Land's The Dark Enlightenment.
Yeah, yeah.
Have you heard of that?
Um,
Yeah.
I, I haven't read it, but I'm familiar with Nick Land and his work.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I'm skeptical to publish it is because Nick Land has, he's been associated with somewhat racial politics, shall we say? And I do not want to be lumped in with that for obvious reasons. But his whole shtick, his whole sort of the negative side of his philosophy is this extended critique of democracy. And one of the things that really struck me in the Dark Enlightenment is he basically says, look, why this naivety and unself-reflectiveness about democracy? For thousands of years, democracy has been considered an inevitable sort of stage on the road to something else. It's not been the sine qua non of political perfection. For most of human history, including the American founding fathers, it was considered, it would inevitably lead to anarchy and oligarchy and decadence.
Yeah.
It wasn't, the founding fathers were not Democrats.
Mhm.
And yet democracy is one of those sort of, to Christians, it's like invoking the Holy Ghost. It's this automatically good thing.
Yeah.
You see in the tweets of people like Owen Jones, it's just democracy, democracy, democracy. Our democracy is under attack. And you think, well, after a while, I did it anyway. I think, well, so what? Like, you can have, uh, you know, you can have enlightened despotisms and functioning empires. There are all sorts of ways to live in the world. Democracy is not the only game in town. Does that ring true for you? I mean, when you say that you were skeptical of democracy or bored of it or whatever it was you said, I can't remember. I mean, what are your thoughts there?
But going back to the writing thing, there is, virtually there's very little theoretical basis in how I see the world and how I sort of capture the world. So I couldn't cite for you some obscure thinker on democracy. It's just a matter of my own observations.
Mm.
My mind, democracy succeeds in very few things, and those things aren't good things. They keep the public in a permanent state of division. It provides moral cover for a fundamentally immoral ruling class. It does not create a ruling class of optimal leaders, just ones who are superficially popular. Take
Demagogues.
but yeah, basically, yeah, essentially, yeah. Take Jeremy Corbyn pledging free broadband for the nation, or plant 15,000 trees a second forever. Like or but also there's various kind of I think erroneous assumptions like democracy and liberty being linked, or democracy and prosperity being linked.
Oh, I would say democracy and liberty are actually very fundamentally antagonistic.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, and if you look back on the COVID age, which I don't believe was the birth of a new world order or whatever, or Great Reset or anything like that, but I do believe was fundamentally a political crime that went down for that set period of time. That was done by governments who were elected by the by the plebeians, whatever, and those and in those years, the governments of not necessarily Britain, but I think like Australia, New Zealand, France, America, you know, at times behaved in a way that was more despotic than hereditary monarchs. Pre Bill of Rights, and as well as that, I think it neuters in many people the justifiable desire to overthrow the liberal edifice as well. People think that if you go into a booth and put an X in a box, then you're having your say in how society is run. You're not.
You're
Yeah,
not. No.
absolutely not. It provides a clear route to power for demagogues who, again, who can just promise the moon and stars, and people will buy it because it's only as good as the educational apparatus, which in this country is absolutely fucked.
Yeah, that's one way of stating it. Yeah, yeah. The case of Australia really depressed me. Actually, I'm half Australian. My mum's Australian. She's actually there now on a holiday to see her parents. And when I've been there 3 times, twice when I was kind of too young to really remember. I remember bits and bobs. And then in 2013, before I went to university, I did the whole gap year thing. And they struck me as exactly the kind of people you hear about, that they are legitimately, at least in Queensland, where I was based, earthy, straight talking, straight shooting, politically incorrect
Yeah.
people. And that comes with its downsides. I did meet
But
quite a few.
is bogan the word?
Yeah, but lots of both. Yeah. And then to see Australia descend into basically totalitarianism during the COVID period. Okay, more limited to the state of Victoria, but it was quite depressing. But then again, Victoria is, and this is why Americans, or I can't believe I'm saying this because as a European and an Englishman, I suppose, I don't want to betray my own roots, but the worst thing Americans could do, given their setup and their history, is become more European. And the extent to which Victoria and Australia is more European than the rest of the country is the extent to which they felt, free enough to become totalitarian or authoritarian.
I read somewhere, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I was told this once that I can't remember his name, but the Premier of Victoria signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative. I don't know if that's true, but I heard it once.
It probably is.
Probably is, yeah.
Australia is a weird country. Back in the 70s, one of its prime ministers was walking along the beach and got sucked into the sand and was never seen again.
Yeah. Also, I heard a story that either the current or the most recent Prime Minister of Australia once had a bit of an accident in a McDonald's as well.
Or an accident.
Yeah, no, okay, yeah, okay. So when I was doing my podcast, I did interview with two Aussies. This is like middle of 2021, so it was when Australia had, like, in my eyes then, fallen, right? And it was two Aussies, and they told me that's Scott Morrison.
Yeah.
Once to, if you pardon my French, shit himself in a Mackey's queue. So it's it's a very very bizarre place.
Nothing we haven't done in London on a Friday night.
Everyone's been there. Everyone's been there.
So amidst all of this doom and gloom.
Sorry, that a boy racist just drove past.
Oh yeah, no, you get that. I live right next to a road. I'm familiar. I see about 4 car crashes a day. It's quite exciting. Amidst all of this doom and gloom, what sustains you other than your devotion to writing and to art? And I suppose I'm hinting at faith and religious faith. I mentioned earlier, I'm glad God loves people, because I sure as hell find it difficult. I mean, I wasn't always religious. I'm a Christian. And it still baffles me that I am, because I never thought I would be. I was the last person I thought I would be. Are you religious? I believe you told me that you weren't, but
Much to my chagrin, I'm not.
much to your chagrin. That's interesting. Why do you say that?
I'm an agnostic who very, very much wishes he could be religious.
What do you think it would take you?
Probably just it's okay. This is ironic because I have a theory on a sort of a what I think to be a realistically tenable view of God, but it would have to be some sort of sort of road to Damascus conversion. It has to be sort of countenance divine in my bedroom window. Unfortunately, because I did I flirted with religion for quite a long time, and I attended church regularly, and I think to a degree I was LARPing. I was LARPing as the kind of the trad Christian, back when the trad moment was very much in vogue. Um, I'm not an atheist. I'm not an atheist. That's the first thing to make clear. I'm not an atheist. What I believe in this may already be a very well traversed hillside, and forgive me if I'm sort of passing off well-known theories my own, but I do believe in a degree that if I were to meet God, if he was to walk through my door right now and greet me in some way, I think it would be too much for a mortal to handle, and I would immediately void my bowels and die. So in a sense, the only way of interpreting that kind of truth that is too much for a mortal to bear is to wrap it up in mythology and legend and story and narrative, which is what the Bible would be in that view. You know, um, then also at the same time, I mean, sort of scientists love to kind of dunk on religion as if let there be light and the Big Bang aren't very similar imagery. you know and obviously if there is a god who's capable of omnipotence and omnipresence and benevolence, and that's someone who clearly operates on a much higher level than a person who can't even who could only live in linear time. So for that person, that being, 7 days would probably be billions of years. So where I find optimism is in just kind of, I suppose, what today we call like wellness culture or like well-being culture. Apart from the smoking and drinking, I generally like to look after myself, but also I posit that myself being very much an individual, very much immune to marketing and propaganda, which comes with blessing and curse. But one of the blessings is that the last frontier is my own mind. So when you know to quote Kipling again, if all around you're losing your heads, keep yours. Or if you can keep your head while all around you lose theirs. When there is this kind of pernicious propaganda of effectively a regime all around you in every encounter you experience, the last frontier is your own mind. So if you can, keep yourself away from anger and despair and resentment and depression and neurasthenia and anxiety, then that's the last frontier. Keep that, and you've held the final line. So that's where I find kind of inner peace. Optimism is hard as a come by. There are two simultaneous realities. One is the world at large, and one is my own life. I don't think I can really affect the world in any meaningful way. I can't change the way the world is, but I can be happy. I can achieve happiness within this kind of neoliberal hyper progressive rat race. I have a partner who I very much love and and enjoy the company of. I have very close friendships. I'm able to have chats like this, which make me feel very very sort of comfortable, and I like fraternizing and that sort of thing. And one thing that I find as well that this actually kind of goes back to Brideshead as well is I have a very strong sense of fraternity in my life. I have very close male friendships, which I think is the antidote to two things. One is the sort of the crisis of young male suicide and despair and incel and whatever, and the other one is the kind of the lad Bible mental health mate kind of approach to your own psyche, which is platonic brotherly love. And I had that in abundance. So those things in congruence kind of keep me happy and sane, as well as writing, which is what's giving me meaning without faith. Yeah.
Yeah,
Although at the same time, I do desire faith because I really, really fear dying.
oh, okay, right.
I find death absolutely. I mean, if you aren't religious and you don't believe in, permanence of the soul, death is a fucking terrifying thing.
Well, I suppose I have no right to say that as a religious believer, I don't find it terrifying because, you have to get there first to know whether you're terrified, don't you? It would be, just bravado on my part to claim that I don't fear death. I don't think about death. I'm not like, early Montaigne. It doesn't consume me. I've known some people for whom death is just, it's not just all of the great philosophers recommend thinking about death on a regular basis to sort of gird up your loins, as it were. I have known some people for whom just a moment's reflection on death literally terrifies them and kind of ruins their day. I've never been like that. I don't think about it. Um, have you ever read much Philip Larkin?
Yeah, I remember. Yeah,
There's that lovely line. I can't remember. I have to paraphrase, I'm afraid. In his poem Orbard, where he's got that image of when you're caught without people or drink, that furnace fear of death sort of sneaks up on you and terrifies the living shit out of you.
yeah,
That happens to me occasionally when I'm caught without people or drink. Um, I thought that I was fairly good at being on my own, but since I was in a relationship, then I wasn't, blah blah blah. But now that I live on my own, um, I've come to realize that I'm actually not very good at it. I do want someone there to sort of stave off that. Because
yeah.
if you don't have, it's like with your novel, when you've always got something to work on, that's great. But if you suddenly catch yourself out and you don't have anything, a book that you're really enjoying or a piece of writing that you're working on, you're just suddenly left alone with your own existence. It can be quite terrifying. Um,
It's interesting you mentioned Orbard because I mean the opening line is I work all day and get half drunk at night, right? It's just sort of mirrors my own life where I work 40 hours a week at a job that doesn't make me happy, and the respite I get is through either like tonight I drank half a bottle of wine or my fraternal bonds. Um, but no, I mean I'm
It's
quite
very
for
Victorian, isn't it? Sorry to interrupt, but it's as soon as you said fraternal bonds, I immediately went to Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, Crisis of Masculinity, all the rest of it, and then you beat me to it. I do think that's the secret for lots of young men. They don't I don't want to sound all kind of bleeding heart about it, but there is something to not being able to talk about your feelings as a man. But the problem is, I think a lot of feminists, what they get wrong is that they think that men need to talk about their feelings in the same way that women talk about their feelings. It's actually not what they need. What they need is male companionship, and then they won't need to talk about their feelings.
Yeah, and that's one thing that the I don't think any feminists would deny that their movement has destabilized society. They'll say it's a good thing. They won't deny that it's happened. And one consequence of that is that the ways in which men were bonded. If you look back, and if you rewind the clock 100 years, if you look at the life of a man, say for argument's sake, a man of the upper or upper classes, right? They were schooled alongside boys if they went into the military or to university or the clergy around men, and they were bonded effectively for life. And that's why I think one erroneous understanding of brideshead, even though even war did have a phase of being, sort of, I say bisexual, is that Charles and Sebastian have a sexual relationship. When I think it's about again that very intense fraternal brotherly love that was just so normal to men at the time that now is so irrational that historians look back on that and see Coleridge and Wordsworth gay, Charles and Sebastian gay, uh, Percy Shelley and Byron gay.
Or indeed Montaigne and La Boétie.
Yeah, right, exactly. Whereas I think realistically, men were a lot more intimate without being sexual then, and it created it's created very distinct, clear bonds, and you still see it in some parts of the world. I mean, even countries where being gay is can get you like corporal punishments. I went to India about 5 years ago, and men walk around holding hands. It's not a romantic or sexual thing. It's just I think men naturally bond in that way without it being sort of interpreted as being purely through the lens of modern hypersexualized sort of culture that's affected by things like pornography. So yeah, I mean, I think that is the antidote to the crisis of despair among young men, as well as the quite pernicious individuals such as Tate, who come in and that they. I can see why Tate became what he did, because if you're a young guy watching his videos, you probably have heard constantly how shit you are, how evil you are, how your natural masculinity is something wrong about it, and then this guy tells you,
Toxic.
yeah, right, and then this guy comes along who's on the surface has the cigars, the Bugatti, the beautiful submissive women all around him, and it tells you no, and you're good, you're a force for good in this world. I can see why that would be seductive, but at the same time, what he's selling men is just materialism.
Well, yeah, I mean, I had no notion of the existence of Andrew Tate before he blew up, and I broadly agree with you. I can well see why he's become popular, um, and I think it's just stupid to deny why he's become popular, to deny the conditions that have led to that. I mean, from a Christian perspective, what he's selling is basically satanic. It's
Right, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it's mammon. He's not saying, get shacked up to a beautiful woman and live a happy life and have kids and buy a
Yeah.
house and read books. He's saying whore, basically. And that's no good for men or women. It's depressing to me that I see so many otherwise wholesome young men fall for this shtick. And this is why he's fundamentally different from Jordan Peterson, just by the by. Jordan Peterson is advocating, I think, wholesome solutions to the problem. Tate isn't, but that's a digression.
Sure. Okay. So, but here's a question for you though. Do you think if you were 15 or 16, knowing obviously I didn't know you back then, but knowing yourself, do you think you would have been seduced by it? Because I would have. I absolutely would have been seduced by it if I was a
Um, I think I would. I think I would have been, alas, but I also think this isn't blowing my own trumpet or anything, but I also think I've always had the mental resources to pull back from those kinds of influences and reassert independence of mind. I'm quite, what's the word? I'm quite throughout my life, when I was at university, I went through a Stoic phase, then I went through an Epicurean phase, everything, depending on what I was reading. And to some extent, particularly for a writer, you write according to your influences. That's inevitable. But I've always had the independence of mind just to pull back from that and reassert my own convictions.
what's
But I
your
think I would have been, yeah.
what's your degree in your bachelor's in?
Philosophy, straight philosophy. It was at a Catholic university. It was part of the University of London. It's closed down now because it turns out Catholic priests aren't very good financial administrators. So that was sad because it really was my brideshead. But yeah, no, I studied straight philosophy, a bit of theology lumped in. And yeah, I loved it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
I,
didn't want to
I,
study literature. I'm not dissing literature degrees at all. But I didn't want to study literature because I didn't think I needed anyone to tell me how to enjoy a book.
no, I had the exact same thing where I was planning to do literature. I did history in the end.
Ah,
I was yeah I had a
I
similar
wish
thing.
I had done history actually.
I very much do. I mean, again, for a good time, it did kill my ability to read for pleasure because I was reading for school
Yeah.
almost constantly, and I was reading a lot of what I knew then and now speak complete tat. It's a lot of like historical materialism, and my I just to go off on a tangent, I did sort of have to fight to get my dissertation published because or to get mine approved because I wrote about the 15th century in a non-negative light.
Oh,
Um,
okay, so it wasn't just a completely, shitty,
like,
benighted
yeah,
era. It was actually quite good.
it wasn't like that bit in the Holy Grail where the peasants are like, eating mud and
Mm,
and they formed this kind of anarcho-syndicalist collective. It wasn't. Yeah, I you can cut this off if you need to, but I wrote mine about basically how the 15th century was the birth of modernity in a sense.
yeah.
With the Reformation, the printing press, discovery of the New World, fall of Constantinople, a lot of things kind of that laid the very foundation of modern. But yeah, no, I very much would love the idea of sitting around old ornate buildings and reading books all day. But again, knowing what I luckily knew back then, I knew that I wouldn't be reading my kind of book at university. It would
Yeah.
be it would be sort of contemporary kind of sort of Windrush core just affirmations really.
Had Larry Siedentop published his book on the birth of liberalism when you were writing your dissertation?
It was 2018, so I'm not sure.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, either way, I mean, you've been vindicated in your opinions by the sounds of it. I mean, I didn't know what no one in with any degree of knowledge of that period any longer describes, the low, middle, or high Middle Ages as the Dark Ages anymore. It's just
Yeah,
not tenable.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's again, going back to university. I mean, I just I do agree with you in a sense. I wouldn't want my children to be sort of in that meat grinder. Um, but I really loved my time there. Like I said, I had this kind of I fell in with this kind of like fashionable clique of kind of old money types, and I was kind of their kind of show and tell kind of middle class kid. But yeah, I loved it, and it's something that I can never quite recreate. I haven't really gone back to my uni town since then. Um, so I just don't think I ever could. I don't think I could ever recreate that. Same with I mentioned about the in the article about the my week among the aristocrats. I couldn't go back.
yeah,
I never could, and that's and I think that's a sign of my own kind of burgeoning maturity that I understand that I could never go back because I would just be chasing the dragon. You know,
yeah. I've tried to recreate, uh, you know, evenings even, let alone weeks with old friends, and they've never quite matched up to the former glory. Not with all of them. Um, and
yeah.
that as you say is one of the it's that is a sign of maturity. I think
I,
one of them.
I
You,
suppose
you
I suppose
just accept that you can't recreate it, and
yeah.
you look for other
I think
like these things.
the key ingredient just is I think it's just spontaneity, right?
Yeah, exactly. You don't plan on that, and at the time, they're not as good as they are in retrospect.
That's something I'm trying to work on myself is trying to allow myself to kind of live in the day I'm in. But
Yeah,
I think people who are kind of anxious or like nostalgic or whatever kind of word fit yourself, have this unfortunate ability or fortunate affliction where they can only really live in yesterday or tomorrow. Very rare can they live in today. And when you have memories like that, you kind of just live in them and you kind of chase them. To quote Bride said, as ghosts said to do.
mm,
And there's something quite sad about it. But again, that sadness does kind of fuel writing in a way.
yeah, it does. It does. I've had to live in the moment a lot recently, because when you don't, I don't have very much money at all because I've been freelance, for the last 4 months, and hopefully I have my first trial shift at a new job tomorrow, and it's just a local thing, behind the counter, but I don't care, and that's the thing is, going back to the coming full circle before we wrap up, what you said at the beginning about tolerating the jobs that you hate on paper, with the qualifications and experience I have, I should be, high flying in London, doing this, doing that, fat bank account. Now, don't get me wrong, I'd like enough money to be able to start a family and do all the rest of these things. And I'm still working towards that. But I've never really been the ambitious type in that sense. So long as I have enough money to live day by day, look forward to the evenings, have a glass of wine, walk my dog, who's been very patient.
I can see it. Yeah.
Thing down there. That's all that's all that really matters to me. Christ said, live as the lilies of the valley, or something like that.
Yeah.
Buddha said it too in his own way, and I think our culture is peculiarly immune to that insight,
Yeah.
but we need to rediscover it.
If I can sort of do a very mild bit of shilling here. My
Go
my
for it.
my called the title The Passenger is coming out fairly soon, and there's a section in that I think kind of speaks to what we've discussed at points today, which is there's a section that's roughly based on the Week with the Aristocrats, where my protagonist goes down to a country house and he's fallen in love with a debutante who's engaged to some new money kind of oil type, and he recites some of his poetry during a power outage to kind of sort of up the group's mentality. And the businessman says to him, like what's the monetary application of this? Like, what's the business utility of this?
Yeah,
He says, words said to the poetry of my line of work is growth, yield, that sort of thing. And the protagonist replies, like I don't crave money. I don't, all I desire is creative fulfillment and my most basic needs met. And sure, if your basic needs are, family, house, it's the bit there to be gleaned. But I mean, if you can live your life, especially if you have the creative instinct, which not everyone has, very few people have. So if you have it, embrace it. Yeah, you don't need the Tate lifestyle. You just need, your basic needs met, a degree of freedom and fulfillment in your creative endeavors. And then
mm,
I do genuinely believe that that's the nearest you can get to true happiness. Is that
I think so, and love as well. To
love
love and
and
be
love?
loved.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I forgot love, but love, yeah, true.
Have you, just very quickly before we wrap up, have you ever read Howard's End by Ian Forster?
I have, yeah, yeah.
Reminds me of that. Yeah, the
I-
meeting of the two worlds, the
yeah,
creative and business. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
It's one of the book, yeah, Ian Forster, yeah. But yeah, that's my kind of sort of sign off. I try these days not to be a doomer, and I don't believe I have been in this podcast.
you
But
haven't.
if I have been at any point accidentally, then have that as being my sort of last message. Fall in love, make art, and don't worry about Bugattis because they won't make you happy.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's a good place to. I could talk for you for hours, Sam. But I know you've got to go. So, just in wrapping up, your new novel. When's that published?
There's no fixed date yet, but it's there'll be more if you want to follow Bournebrook magazine on Twitter. That's where all announcements will be, as well as whatever I write in the future, article wise or novel wise, will be hosted there. Yeah, so if you want to go onto there, then any updates will be announced there.
And what is the Bournebrook magazine in a tweet?
In a tweet, it is a magazine for anyone who looks out the world and thinks, "What the hell is going on?"
Perfect. Well, I will leave the links to your work and the Bournebrook magazine and everything in the description to the video. But it's been an absolute pleasure making your acquaintance and talking to you.
So, yeah, it's been really great fun. I've hosted many podcasts. I've never really been on one before, so I wasn't sure if I had anything of meaning to say. But if I've been interesting to anyone listening, then just search SD Wickett on Twitter, and you can find me. And yeah, I'm always looking to make new friends online. So just reach out and Oscar and I just started talking on DMs, and we've made fast friends. So that's where I find me.
Excellent.
Great.
Good to have you.
Likewise. Take care.